Hey, everybody. So I want to talk about trauma as a subjective experience in relation to an experience I had in December. I just want to read it. I wrote a quote about it because I was thinking a lot about it today, feeling into it today. So let me start with a quote. If someone says that they were traumatized, they were traumatized. It's that simple. Trauma is a subjective experience. It makes no difference if you can relate to their experience or if it fits into culturally approved trauma categories. What matters is that the person identified their experience as a trauma. That's all we need to know. If we can move our compassion needle in this direction, we will truly change the world. So I had this experience in December. I'm not getting into all the details around it, but I experienced, I terminated a 4-year long friendship and some things happened that I experienced on a subjective level as trauma. Now, I didn't identify it as trauma at first. I felt the discomfort. I felt this wide surge of emotions. I went through a whole process and I'm still in that process. But partly because of my kind of male conditioning, but I think largely because the experience that felt particularly traumatizing didn't fit into my familiar categories where, we're moving the needle so beautifully, culturally, collectively, the acknowledgement that we're all trauma survivors to one degree or another in our lives. Um, and we're identifying various sort of categories of experience as trauma, and that broad group of categories keeps expanding. First it was like one or two things, certain types of abuses and assaults, and now it's broadening. And it's beautiful that it's doing that because it means that, people can be empathically received for a broad range of different experiences that they identify as trauma. Um, but this particular experience didn't really fit into those now culturally acceptable categories, I guess. And so I didn't really understand that I was experiencing what had happened as a trauma. And also that I was am in still after over 6 months a what I would consider to be a PTSD response. And I'm not comfortable saying that. I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it. Partly because of my male conditioning and partly because I've had so many years without really feeling like, I feel like I was writing from past learning and experience for years. It was like I kind of plateaued and everything was pretty good. And I didn't experience much in the way of severe traumas. And, I wasn't getting in my own way. It was just like super focused and productive. And then this thing happened and whoa, I made a list today. I was just trying to like identify now that I can come out and talk about it as a trauma. So I was like listed from the age of 18 to 58. So childhood aside, in childhood there were traumas, but the whole thing was a trauma. It was like systemic trauma, it's different, But I listed from 18 to 58, I've had like these 4 identifiable things that have happened that I would consider to be big T traumas for me. And the first 3 were more like, familial stuff, betrayal, um, you know, assault kind of stuff. Um, and then there's this. And what I'm learning from, and not that I think you always have to learn from a trauma, I think telling trauma survivors they have to learn some lesson is ridiculously insensitive and ungrounded. And I wrote a lot about that in Grounded Spirituality. It's preposterous. But sometimes there's a takeaway, sometimes. And, I usually try to find one, or I find one, and then I end up writing from it. Maybe I'll write a book called Trauma as a Subjective Experience, because what I've learned from this, and I think it's really important as we continue to sort of move the needle in the direction of really understanding that to one degree or another, everybody in this world is a trauma survivor. Small T traumas, big T traumas, however we define them. But I think what we now need to do is move in the direction of understanding. For those of us who aren't, and I'm certainly one of those people that need to learn this, I think, the trauma is a subjective experience, which means it's not about categories of trauma. It's not about what we've defined as trauma. If somebody says, I experienced that event based on how I'm organized internally, based on my triggers, based on my, I don't know, ancestral history, based on this how I was feeling that day, my physical health and well-being, whatever it is, all the things that factor into why we respond subjectively to something in the way that we do. If they say to you, I experienced that as a real severe trauma, you don't have to think about it. You don't have to go inside and decide whether you can empathically relate to it or something. It doesn't matter. If they tell you that that's their experience, it's their experience. Um, and I think it's important. I've really felt it in this experience because I, first of all, couldn't even acknowledge to myself that it was a trauma, like for a while, because male conditioning. I'll talk about that in a second, but really because it just sort of didn't exactly. It was this sort of strange events and didn't really fit into exactly the normal categories, and that didn't do me any good because I think it was important for me to really, really acknowledge it on every level, just how traumatizing this experience was, how destructive it was. I mean, nothing, of all those four major traumas, this was the one that has affected me the most and is at the same time, in a way, the least tangible. Um, Affected my health, affected my focus, affected my working life, has affected everything. And I had reached a stage where I didn't think much could affect me. I'm just going to like create all the way to the end, you know, but it's affected me. So the takeaway is trauma is a subjective experience. So when you have the bandwidth to hold a space for someone who's sharing with you what they've been through, don't make any assumptions. Don't decide that you can't relate to it or it's not in the right categories, or just forget about it. If they tell you it was traumatizing, they were traumatized. And I think this is a huge step forward collectively to get that and stop, doing what we do as humans, which is categorizing and judging and labeling and deciding what is and what isn't. Let this subjective experience, let it be heuristic inquiry. Let the person who went through the experience tell you that they felt traumatized. And, I mean, if we do that, we're going to end up having to acknowledge the fact that there is so much more trauma than many of us were able to acknowledge for many, many years, centuries. But I think that's the only way home. I think that's really the only way home. And the gender conditioning piece, which isn't really about, trauma as a subjective experience or not, is I can't believe this reappeared in me. It was like, I was like embarrassed to talk about. It's like unacceptable, it's like old style gender conditioning. And I'm somebody who's been writing about, healing and transformation and growth and all those things so freely for years. But this thing hit me in a place where I just felt like the ground beneath my feet was shaky. And I found myself berating myself like on a gender level, like man up, buddy, like man up, buddy. And I can't believe that narrative still inside of me, but it is. And it wasn't serving me. There's times when that serves you in life on a survivalist level, but it was making it worse because I couldn't even reach the stage of acknowledging just how difficult this was for me. It's just like a terrible thing to think about. Like you're having a genuinely having a PTSD response to something, which means all kinds of things are going on inside that are uncomfortable and dysregulating, and keep going back to the event and recycling the event and being in the feelings related to the recycling of the event. And it's like you've never left the event. And yet you've got this like narrative coming through in the heart of it that's saying, come on, man up, buddy. Toughen up, big guy. You're a teacher now. You got to stay solid. You got to hold the space for people. Savage, I mean, I get that part of me served a purpose to help me build a life. I get it. I don't despise that part of me at all, but it just makes me feel a lot for the survivalist world where we're just sort of like trained to put everything away, don't look back, right? Just, get food on the table, just keep practical. And yet there's all of this stuff surging up and down and moving all around inside of us that wants to be acknowledged, that wants to be recognized, that wants to be embraced, that wants to be grieved, raged, that wants to be moved on through so that the system can calm down and regulate and maybe find some transformation in the heart of the experience. We can't get to it because these armoring voices, the voice of my male armor just keeps coming and telling me to just put it away. And who gives a shit about it and all the rest of it. So it's all happening at the same time. So what's my takeaway? It's American style. I have a takeaway. Trauma is a subjective experience. It's really important. And the interface with the survivalist aspect of our conditioning, and the part of us that wants to acknowledge the difficulty of what we've been through, the hope of healing it, is not going to go away too quickly. It's all there. It's all happening at the same time. We have to have a lot of faith, and understand that those of us who are willing to shed the conditioning for periods of time and go deep into the caverns, the trauma tunnels, where we're holding the material. This is really powerful, courageous work. And, it's been easy for me to say that for years, writing from a more solidified place. But now that I'm feeling a little shakier, in a way, it's even more courageous to be able to say that and to go back down into those depths and try to work this stuff through. I hope there's some transformation if it's hard. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope that's helpful.